Dr. Joseph Graves is a professor of biological sciences at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. He has published widely on biological aging and bacterial responses to nanomaterials, but he has a real interest in the underrepresentation of minorities in science and questions about biological definitions of race and racism. And in fact, that's the subject of his upcoming book that he co-authored. Dr. Graves, thank you so much for speaking to me. And what is the what is the name of your new book? And when is it going to be out?
All right, so the new book is entitled Race and Racism, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. My co-author is Dr. Alan Goodman from Hampshire College, and the book will be published by Columbia University Press in October of 2021.
Excellent. Coming up in October. So we just enjoyed your presentation for the Sigma Xi Pizza Lunch, and a lot of it was a timeline of our evolving concept of race. I guess that's a pretty interesting and sticky question. What is race? I noticed that in your timeline, you had the publication of Darwin's book, and in the title of his book, which wasn't about humans, it references favored races and competition. So what is race? Is it like, I have a fuzzy idea of what species is. Is race an actual biological concept, and where would it fit in there? And do we use it for other animals like Darwin was using it, not in reference to humans?
Okay, so the key thing that Darwin gave us was the method by which species came into existence. Now, for Darwin, that was natural selection. And so Darwin's model, which can be understood as descent with modification, begins with, a uniform species. And when I say uniform, that sort of is itself an oxymoron, because one of the aspects that makes natural selection work is the presence of variation. So we'll say relatively uniform group. But then as this uniform group begins to adapt to new environments, they begin to diverge in gene frequency or allele frequency. Over time, this difference can become significant enough so that these formerly united populations are no longer capable of mating with each other and producing fertile offspring. So in Darwin's model, these now become new species. So now the question becomes, what happens to the genetic composition of those species in the time between the origin of the species and the formation of these new species? So somewhere between those two events, we begin to see an accumulation of local adaptations. And so this question of what is a biological race is in and of itself, as Ernst Mayr pointed out in his comment, somewhat arbitrary. In other words, how much genetic variation does there have to be before a taxonomist looks at these animals and says, well, those are now geographical races? And that, as I said, it's completely arbitrary. So Wright gave us a more precise genetic definition, but you could argue, if you really wanted to, that Wright's decision of, 0.250 in his population subdivision statistic is arbitrary, because he's simply saying, I'm assigning a probability to the fixation of specific genes in those populations. And above that, you definitely have fixation of these different genes. And below that, you don't. So in reality, the concept of a biological race is in and of itself problematic. But if we treat humans as we treat other species, then using the metrics which are associated with the definition of what a biological race should be, then we don't have them. Now, those two metrics have to do with, one, whether there is more genetic variation between the groups in question versus the genetic variation within them. Now, if you want to think about it, I'm sure there are people in the audience who have training in statistics. This is similar to the structure of the analysis of variance, right? You don't say that groups are statistically different from each other when they overlap each other so much, right? You say they're the same. So what you really need is for the groups to be like this, different from each other and not overlapping. Then you would say, oh, now you have biological races. Well, we don't have that in humans. What we have in humans is a complete overlap of our populations with regard to genetic variants. And as I pointed out in one of the slides where we showed actual adaptations that occurred in human populations, they're few and far between. And so when we look at the average human being, okay, and again, using the term average human being is itself problematic, but 99.9% of the human genome is shared by any two randomly chosen individuals, chosen from anywhere in the world. So that leaves you, 0.1%, but 0.1% of 3.3 billion nucleotides, that's not an insignificant number. It's 300 million nucleotides. But when you look in that 300 million nucleotides, 85% of that is cosmopolitan, meaning found all over the world. Only about 10% is localized to continental regions, and only about 5% to regions within continents. And so the ability to try to claim that any of our populations really represent geographically adapted local races is fallacious. Just you
and it's certainly
so many hoops to do it. It's not.
Yeah, and it certainly hasn't come anywhere near the inability to breed or anything remotely like that. Well, what about, one that I've always encountered? I'm Jewish. I'm not very religious, which is why I sometimes say I'm Jewish. But all my life, this has been a topic of whether are Jews a race or an ethnicity or religion. Now, obviously, Judaism is a religion, but what about I don't know the firm answer on this. I know for a fact that Judaism is a religion, but as far as what's an ethnicity versus a race, and there is something. How come so many people can look at me and know that I'm Jewish immediately? And I'm not even the most Jewish looking guy.
I'm sorry. When I looked at you, I did not assume that you were Jewish.
Well, I'm glad, but is there something, there are some looks that there are some stereotypes.
And that's what they are. They're called stereotypes.
Yes.
So just to give you an example, one of the great anthropologists of the 20th century, Ashley Montagu, who you may know of, wrote the book, Race, Mankind's Most Dangerous Myth. Now, Montagu himself was of Jewish descent, and he trained in anthropology in England, and he became a world-renowned thinker. And his first book, Race, Mankind's Most Dangerous Myth, was published in 1942, in which time period, the question of whether Jews were a race was a major question of great historical international importance. So the Nazi race scientists created the idea of a Jewish race, and Montagu answers them in this book, and he points out that Judaism is a religion practiced by people from all over the world with different ancestries, and that in the regions in which Jewish people lived, that their physical appearance was not different from the populations that they lived next to. So, for example, in Palestine, the ancient Jewish populations and the Palestinians don't look any different from each other. In fact, we've done whole genome sequencing of those groups, and their genomes overlap. And so there are also Jews in Ethiopia and Jews in Northern Africa, called Sephardic Jews, and they're not different from the other people who lived there. And the Ashkenazim were no different from the Eastern Europeans who lived there. So, one of the things that was necessary by both the ancients, here I mean the medievals, like Pope Innocent, is they had to give Jews identification badges. And it's amazing the similarity between the identification badges used by Pope Innocent and those that were used by the Nazis in the 20th century. Are literally the same design.
That's interesting. If it was really obvious, you wouldn't need to use those.
You wouldn't need identification badges. That's absolutely correct.
So interestingly then, so say Jews in Europe have all these characteristics in common with the people around them, and Jews in the Middle East have characteristics around them. And then these two different groups of Jews might actually have different. So there we're looking at like, see, they have a lot of things in common with the physically close to them, and they have differences from the Jews from a different part of the world. So
Yes.
so it's not uniformly different.
Yeah, and I don't want to, cast aspersions, but dark-skinned Jews in Israel talk about discrimination against them because of their dark skin color. So even within Judaism as a culture and a religion, there is discrimination based upon skin color.
Excellent. So let me ask you a question about your talk. We have a question that at the last point in your presentation, you were talking about ancestry, and was it to show how it depends more on the history of the slave trade?
In the case of the Latinos in the Caribbean and of African Americans in North America, absolutely. Now, one can ask the question, well, where did this European ancestry come from in persons of African descent? And we know the answer to this, despite DNA Ancestry Company commercials, about loving slaveholders who wanted their slave mistress to escape to freedom. That's not what happened. Okay, what happened is there was enforced rape in the institution of chattel slavery, and this occurred for hundreds of years. And so the European admixture that we find in persons of African descent in the United States was not consensual. Now, it was more consensual in the Caribbean, because the race theories or cultural race ideas in the Caribbean were very different than those in North America. So in Puerto Rico, one's racial identity there is any European ancestry makes you white. In the United States, any African ancestry makes you black. Now, you have the same individual, right? Dorothy Dandridge was the same person. If she went to a place in the United States that was out in the sticks and they didn't know who Dorothy Dandridge was, they would have treated her like she was a white woman. But because she was internationally renowned as an actress and singer, she had to go through the colored entrance. Same person, same physical appearance, but defined by race, by law. And by the way, depending upon what state she went to, if she had had a DNA test, her racial identity would have changed.
Yes. So I know that you had to condense the subject of your book to make a 1-hour talk and condense it even further to make it a half-hour talk for us today. So I suspect that there's a lot you didn't get to. Most of your presentation focused on this evolving concept of what race is, but I suspect I got the idea that you go into a lot of other social consequences and stuff. What's some stuff that we didn't get to? In fact, let's see how well you can condense things. What is your book about? What's the idea that you're presenting in the book beyond what you were able to share with us in the talk?
Well, the main structure of the book is to answer people's longstanding misconceptions about what race is and therefore how racism operates in our society. So there's a whole set of questions that we always come in contact with, which is, one, do human beings have biological races? That's what we address in chapter 3, race, all you want to know about race and genetics. And then, of course, there are the questions that circulate around disease. Now, just a few days ago, I gave a lecture on this at the George Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, in which I was explaining to medical doctors that human beings don't have biological races, and all the things that they think are race-specific diseases are not. And in conjunction with that, I've been asked by Elsevier, who's the publisher of my nanomaterials book, to go through their holdings, particularly in medicine. And so I'm helping to edit Robin's Pathology, which is one of the most widely selling medical pathology textbooks in the country, to take out all of these false concepts of biological difference between races.
What's the proper concept then? If like for those doctors that are thinking of a certain disease that's race specific, what's the better way to describe what it is?
Well, as I said, none of these diseases are, quote, race specific.
Right.
So it's a question of, what is an individual's ancestry and what is the probability that that ancestry may be associated with a specific disease risk variant. So we'll take the poster child for this, sickle cell trait. So sickle cell trait is in high frequency wherever falciparum malaria exists. So people of African descent in the United States were taken from regions of Western Africa and Central Africa, where there was high transmission of falciparum malaria. And so when they arrived here in the Americas, they had the same frequency of sickle cell trait as Western Africans did. However, over the course of the last 2 centuries, where malaria transmission in the United States was drastically reduced, guess what happened to the frequency of sickle cell anemia in persons of African descent? It drastically reduced, so that now, okay, people from the Saudi Peninsula and people from Greece have higher frequencies of sickle cell anemia than African Americans do. And by the way, if enslaved people had been taken from the highlands of South Africa, they would have come to America without the sickle cell trait, because malaria does not exist in the highlands of South Africa. And so there are all sorts of other examples, like, for example, Tay-Sachs disease. Tay-Sachs disease was found in high frequency amongst Mediterranean populations, and it continued in high frequency amongst Ashkenazim. But then once people realized that this was a genetic disease, the Ashkenazim in the United States put into practice medical counseling, so that families that were carrying the trait stopped marrying into each other. And now the trait of Tay-Sachs is lower in American Jews than it is in Mediterranean populations. So the idea that Tay-Sachs was a racial trait or sickle cell anemia was a racial trait is absolutely incorrect.
Interesting. Seeing just in your brief bio, the range of your research interests, how they seem broad. Is there a connection? What is between biological aging and bacterial responses to nanomaterials?
Yeah.
To this subject of race?
Natural selection.
Yeah.
That's what prepared me to be able to understand the fallacies in biological race concepts, because Darwin, right, as you said, the title of his book was On the Origin of Species, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So my discipline, evolutionary genetics, we are the ones that study, the origin and maintenance of variation within and between species and within species. So what I do, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I apply evolution to solve different types of problems. So to give you a sense of that, just a week ago, I signed a contract with Basic Books, and I'm working on a follow-up to these 2 books that I wrote in 2020. The title of that book is Voice in the Wilderness: How Evolution Can Help Us Solve Our Biggest Problems. And so in it, I talk about a number of things that I don't talk about in the nanomaterials book or the race book.
What sort of problems are the biggest problems you're talking about?
Well, the biggest one right now is this pandemic we're in the middle of.
Right.
And quite frankly, our way of living has created an evolutionary incubator for dangerous microbes, viruses, and bacteria. And so if we don't change the way we're living, we're going to be seeing more and more pandemics of greater severity and greater frequency. So that's just one of the examples.
And the way we're living as a species in harmony or disharmony with
completely
millions of other species.
Disharmony with the rest of nature.
Yes, from the microscopic up.
Yeah. That's factory farming is the biggest problem.
Factory farming and bringing human population, encroaching on natural lands.
Just encroaching on the rest of the biosphere, because that's one of the things that's presented as being a cause of these new microbes. But the simple fact is, by bringing together livestock at such high densities, you are creating the perfect breeding ground for viruses who don't really care if it's a cow or a bird or a pig or a human. They don't care. Okay, they have the capacity to adapt. And so while SARS coronavirus 2 started in a pangolin bat crossover event, and then into humans, the H1N1 pandemic of 1919 was bird and pig. And by the way, that occurred in Kansas, not in Europe. So calling it the Spanish flu is entirely wrong. But the simple fact is, because we are bringing these domestic animals together in such close proximity to each other, we have created the perfect breeding ground for these dangerous viruses. And if we continue doing this, we are going to have pandemic after pandemic after pandemic. Now, in the past, we didn't have all these people concentrated in cities, and we didn't have the capacity for a person to get on a plane in the Congo and arrive in London 8 hours later. So we've created the perfect environment for.
Well, Dr. Graves, I want to get a last word from you, and thank you for the presentation and the conversation. But why don't you leave us with, like, what do you really, there's so much that we've hit on. What do you want us to know? What's the, beyond the, I mean, the one core message is that the concept of race, there is no biological, it makes no sense. There's no biological concept of race, I would say, is the biggest thing I got from you.
Yeah, let me restate that, because that's.
Yeah, and please tell us again the name of your book and when it's coming out.
Yeah, so the correct statement is that human beings do not have biological races.
Okay.
There is a problematic concept of biological race. So the concept itself is problematic, but it has been heuristic. In other words, it propelled research on variation within species. And now we've demonstrated that in some species, it's legitimate to say that they have biological races, but in our species, it's not. And so that's the take-home message. And all the things associated with thinking racially causes real problems in the lives of human beings that are not inconsequential problems.
And then also, I guess a key, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but a key thing that I got from you is that the similarities that made us call something races, they're not uniform, and there's as much variety, that there's variation. It's not constant. It's not, there aren't these differences between groups, that you can find as much variation within those groups.
We are far more alike than we are different.
Exactly. Excellent. And then the book?
The book is entitled Race and Racism, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions.
Coming out this October.
October 2021.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to bring Fenella back on to say goodbye for us. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graves, and thank you, Brian, for a really informative discussion. It's been really fantastic. I just want to thank all of our attendees for coming today. And if you missed any part of the discussion, if you were late, I think there will be a video posted later. And we hope you'll join us next month. Those invites will go out. And I just want to say, Dr. Graves, we really appreciate your time. It's been really great. Thank you so much again, everybody.
Thank you.